In February 1968, the small town of Orangeburg, South Carolina, became the site of a tragic event that would shake a community and leave a mark on history. At South Carolina State College, a historically black university known for its role in the fight for civil rights, students were determined to stand up against segregation and racial injustice. What began as a peaceful protest soon turned into a moment of heartbreak and loss, as unarmed students faced overwhelming force from local law enforcement and the National Guard. These young men and women were not seeking confrontation, they were demanding the basic rights promised to all Americans. Yet, their courage was met with violence, and in a matter of moments, 3 students lost their lives and dozens more were injured. Despite the severity of this tragedy, it has largely been overlooked in mainstream history, overshadowed by other events of the era. In this video, we will uncover the story of the Orangeburg Massacre, the tensions that led to it, the bravery of the students, and the aftermath that left scars on families and the community. We will explore the lives of those affected, the challenges they faced, and why this event deserves a place in the broader conversation about civil rights and justice. If you want to understand the courage, resilience, and sacrifices of these students and the lessons their story holds for today, stay with us until the end. Do not forget to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you won't miss any of our in-depth historical stories. This is a story that demands to be remembered, and together, we will bring it into the light. In the heart of Orangeburg, South Carolina, the All-Star Bowling Lanes stood as a symbol of the unyielding segregation that still gripped the South in 1968. Long after laws had been passed promising equality, to most passersby, it was just another local business. But to the black students of South Carolina State College, it represented the daily frustrations and indignities of a system determined to keep them as second-class citizens. These students had grown tired of empty promises, of a world that proclaimed equality on paper but denied it in practice, and they decided that their voices could no longer be ignored. It began quietly, almost imperceptibly. A few students ventured into the bowling alley, seeking nothing more than the right to participate as equals, only to be met with the familiar sight of exclusion. Denied service. They were forced into a verbal confrontation with the employees, a clash that revealed the persistent defiance of segregationist attitudes. This was not the first time they had been refused. It was a pattern, a deliberate act of resistance by a business unwilling to honor the law. What might have seemed like a small act of defiance to some was, in reality, a spark waiting to ignite, fueled by years of systemic injustice and the growing impatience of a generation unwilling to wait any longer. The following days saw the situation escalate as more students joined the cause, their numbers swelling with every account of mistreatment. They returned to the All-Star Bowling Lanes not with weapons, not with malice, but with banners of peaceful protest and a steadfast determination to claim what had long been denied to them. Their presence challenged the status quo, and while their intentions were rooted in nonviolence, the response from local authorities suggested they were prepared for conflict. Police officers and members of the National Guard, armed and ready, positioned themselves strategically, anticipating a confrontation that the students had no desire to initiate. As tensions mounted, the story of the students' peaceful defiance began to spread, drawing attention from peers and the wider community who admired their courage and shared in their frustration. The protest was a test of wills between a young generation demanding justice and an entrenched system unwilling to relinquish its control. The students' commitment to civil disobedience highlighted the moral absurdity of segregation. Here were unarmed young people asserting a simple right to enter a public space, facing overwhelming force merely for insisting on their humanity. What happened at the All-Star Bowling Lanes was more than a local incident. It was a microcosm of the broader struggle for civil rights sweeping across the United States. The students' actions reflected the strategies employed nationwide peaceful resistance, direct action, and public demonstration to confront a society still mired in racial prejudice. Their protest exposed the fragile veneer of legal progress in the South, revealing that laws alone could not erase the deep-rooted attitudes and behaviors that perpetuated inequality. This moment at the bowling alley would soon become the catalyst for events that transformed a routine act of protest into a tragic confrontation. Yet it also exemplified the courage and determination of young activists unwilling to accept injustice silently. By standing up, they not only challenged a segregated business, but also asserted their right to be recognized as full members of their community, laying the groundwork for a larger struggle that would demand national attention. The All-Star Bowling Lanes, once a simple place of recreation, became a stage upon which the complexities of race, power, and resistance played out, demonstrating how ordinary spaces can become sites of extraordinary courage and defining moments in the fight for equality. The students of South Carolina State College, fueled by a growing sense of urgency and guided by the principles of the broader civil rights movement, approached their protest at the All-Star Bowling Lanes with a commitment to peaceful civil disobedience that carried both courage and moral clarity. Understanding that their actions were part of a larger struggle for justice that extended far beyond the boundaries of Orangeburg, they were inspired by leaders who had demonstrated that change could be achieved not through violence but through persistence, resilience, and the power of nonviolent resistance, seeing themselves as a continuation of a legacy that demanded dignity and equality for all African Americans, even in the face of entrenched opposition. On that February day in 1968, the students gathered quietly, their minds set on challenging the injustice that had been allowed to persist for far too long. They carried no weapons, and their intentions were simple yet profound: to occupy space that had been unjustly denied to them, to show that the law of the land, though often ignored in practice, was meant to protect their rights, and to assert their humanity in a society that frequently refused to recognize it. Every step they took toward the bowling alley was measured, deliberate, and symbolic, reflecting the discipline instilled by their education and the ideals they had internalized through the teachings of civil rights leaders who had shown that courage could manifest not in retaliation, but in steadfast adherence to justice. The atmosphere was tense, yet there was an unmistakable sense of resolve among the students, a quiet energy that radiated from their collective presence. They understood that their actions might provoke hostility, but they were undeterred, believing that peaceful protest carried a power that violence never could. Their non-violent approach was both a shield and a statement. It asserted their moral high ground, highlighted the disparity between their intentions and the potential reaction of the authorities, and served as a demonstration of strength through restraint, as they faced police officers and members of the National Guard, armed and prepared for conflict. The students' commitment to nonviolence became a testament to their strategic understanding of the struggle. They knew that their peaceful stance exposed the injustice more vividly than any act of aggression could. In addition to their physical presence at the protest, the students' approach included careful coordination, communication, and mutual support, embodying the principles of organization that had been key to civil rights campaigns across the nation. They shared knowledge of past demonstrations, understood the potential risks, and moved with a collective consciousness that emphasized solidarity and accountability. Their peaceful civil disobedience was not passive. It was active, intentional, and rooted in the belief that societal change required not only courage but discipline, moral clarity, and an unwavering refusal to accept the status quo. The actions of these students mirrored countless efforts across the country, where young activists had embraced the philosophy that nonviolence could illuminate the stark contrast between justice and oppression, forcing communities, lawmakers, and the nation at large to confront the moral failures embedded in everyday life. Every chant, every step forward, and every refusal to leave the bowling alley quietly contributed to a broader narrative of resistance, one that connected Orangeburg to a larger movement, demonstrating that even in small towns, ordinary people could embody extraordinary courage. Through their peaceful civil disobedience, the students of South Carolina State College became living examples of the ideals that had guided the civil rights movement: dignity, resilience, and the unshakable belief that justice could be demanded through discipline and moral integrity. Their actions that day would set the stage for both the tragedy and the legacy that followed, showing that even the simplest acts of standing up for one's rights could carry profound consequences, echoing far beyond the immediate moment and leaving a lasting imprint on the struggle for equality. As the peaceful demonstration at South Carolina State College unfolded, the presence of local authorities began to loom larger, casting a shadow over what had started as a simple act of protest for justice. The students, armed only with their courage and a steadfast commitment to nonviolence, were met with a response that reflected fear, misunderstanding, and the ingrained biases of a system determined to maintain control. Police officers, initially observing from a distance, soon increased their numbers, bringing with them an air of intimidation that contrasted sharply with the calm, purposeful demeanor of the students. The atmosphere grew heavier as reports of the demonstration spread, prompting the deployment of the National Guard, a stark reminder of the lengths to which the authorities were willing to go to assert authority over unarmed young people demanding their rights. Despite the escalating show of force, the students remained resolute, understanding that yielding to fear would betray both their cause and the generations who had struggled before them. They stood together, a living testament to the philosophy that nonviolence is not weakness but a form of moral power capable of challenging deeply entrenched injustice. Every gesture, every chant, and every step forward was measured, intended to communicate strength, dignity, and the undeniable truth that they were asserting rights long denied to them. Yet, the tension in the air was palpable. The students could feel the scrutiny of armed eyes upon them, the weight of rifles and batons, and the unspoken threat that even their peaceful presence might be construed as rebellion. The authorities, for their part, were caught in a web of anxiety and perception. Fearing that a simple protest might spiral into chaos, they positioned themselves strategically around the campus, a silent message that any act of defiance would be met with overwhelming force. The National Guard, clad in military attire and equipped with rifles, became a stark visual contrast to the unarmed. Determined students, their presence signaling an expectation of conflict even where none existed. What began as an attempt to uphold the law and protect property quickly morphed into a psychological battle, where the mere sight of armed authority sought to suppress the voices of those seeking equality. In this charged environment, the students' commitment to nonviolence took on profound significance. They navigated the tension with patience, understanding that every action they took would be scrutinized, interpreted, and potentially used against them. The discipline they exhibited highlighted the moral dichotomy between their intentions and the anticipatory aggression of the authorities, underscoring the injustice inherent in a system that preemptively assumed guilt and threat from those who sought only fairness. Their calm perseverance became a silent protest against a narrative that equated black assertion with violence, exposing the deep-seated biases that dictated the authorities' approach. As the evening deepened, the standoff between peaceful students and heavily armed officials illustrated the fragile balance between protest and power, and how easily fear could escalate into tragedy. The tension was not just physical but symbolic, representing the clash between generations of change-makers insisting on equality and an establishment resistant to challenge. The students' unyielding commitment to non-violent action in the face of overwhelming intimidation served as a moral mirror, reflecting the disproportionate responses of those sworn to maintain order and highlighting the ethical chasm between justice and authority. In retrospect, the deployment of police and the National Guard, juxtaposed against the unarmed students, foreshadowed the devastating events to come, yet it also cemented the courage, discipline, and strategic insight of the young activists. Their ability to maintain composure amidst intimidation revealed the depth of their commitment, the sophistication of their resistance, and the profound moral clarity that defined the civil rights movement. This tense moment, where the peaceful and the powerful met in silent opposition, became a defining prelude to the tragedy that would soon unfold, capturing the delicate interplay of fear, authority, and the unshakable pursuit of justice. The night of February 8, 1968, began like any other winter evening in Orangeburg, South Carolina, yet it would quickly turn into a night that no one present would ever forget. The students of South Carolina State College had gathered outside the Felton Gymnasium, their faces illuminated by the faint glow of a bonfire, which had been meant merely for warmth and as a symbol of solidarity, yet was interpreted by authorities as a sign of defiance. These young men and women, still committed to peaceful protest despite the mounting tension and heavy presence of police and the National Guard, could not have imagined that what was meant as a statement of justice would erupt into unimaginable violence. The air was thick with anticipation, a mixture of frustration, fear, and the determination that had brought them there in the first place. And in that charged atmosphere, a single spark would ignite chaos. Reports indicate that an object, possibly a banister or a rock, struck a police officer, though it was unclear from where it came, and some witnesses suggested it may have been thrown by only one individual, entirely separate from the gathered students. Yet, the law enforcement officers, already on edge and heavily armed, perceived the act as a collective threat, a justification in their minds for what would follow. Without warning, the South Carolina Highway Patrol opened fire into the crowd, unleashing a barrage of nearly 70 rounds over the span of 10 to 15 seconds. Panic erupted instantly. Students scattered in all directions, some diving to the ground for cover, others sprinting blindly through the darkened campus, while those caught in the open were struck as they sought safety. The serene campus that had once served as a haven for learning and activism transformed in moments into a scene of terror, confusion, and unimaginable grief. Among the victims were 3 young men whose lives were abruptly stolen in those harrowing seconds. Samuel Hammond, an 18-year-old freshman with dreams of education and a future filled with promise, was shot in the back as he tried to flee the chaos. Henry Smith, just 17, and Delano Middleton, another 17-year-old who was not even a participant in the protest but simply sitting on the steps, were also struck and killed. In total, 28 others suffered injuries, some severe, as bullets tore through the air indiscriminately, showing no regard for age, gender, or intent. Eyewitness accounts describe the pandemonium, screams intermingling with the sharp report of gunfire, students dragging the wounded to relative safety, and an overwhelming sense of disbelief at the sudden, inexplicable violence. The aftermath was devastating, both physically and emotionally. Families received news of deaths and injuries that would forever alter the course of their lives, and the college community was plunged into mourning and shock. The narrative that followed, shaped in part by local authorities and initially by the media, attempted to depict the students as aggressors. But this account quickly unraveled in the face of evidence. The students had been unarmed, their actions nonviolent, and the casualties indiscriminate. The massacre highlighted the extreme measures authorities were willing to take to maintain control, and underscored the deep societal resistance to racial equality. Even in moments meant to be peaceful, that night became a defining moment not only for the students and their families, but also for the broader struggle for civil rights in America. The Orangeburg Massacre was not just an isolated tragedy. It symbolized the dangers faced by those who dared to demand justice and the human cost of systemic oppression. It exposed the fragile promise of equality and the extreme gap between moral ideals and lived reality, leaving an indelible mark on history and serving as a somber reminder of the courage required to confront injustice, even in the face of overwhelming, lethal opposition. The lives lost that night in Orangeburg were not just statistics. They were the vivid, heartbreaking stories of young individuals whose futures were abruptly and violently stolen. Samuel Hammond, an 18-year-old freshman at South Carolina State College, had arrived on campus with dreams of academic achievement and the hope of contributing to his community. Yet his life was cut short in the chaos as he tried to escape the unexpected storm of gunfire. His energy, ambitions, and potential were extinguished in a matter of seconds, leaving family, friends, and classmates to grapple with the incomprehensible loss of someone so full of promise. Henry Smith, only 17, carried the hopes of his family and the aspirations of a young man on the brink of adulthood. Yet he too fell victim, struck down while participating in a protest that demanded no more than the basic dignity and equality that had been legally promised but culturally denied. Perhaps the most tragic was Delano Middleton, also 17, who was not even involved in the protest but happened to be sitting quietly on the steps near the campus gymnasium. His presence was entirely incidental, yet fate placed him directly in the path of violence, a cruel reminder of the indiscriminate nature of that night's events. Middleton's death exemplifies the shocking reality that when systemic oppression and fear collide with militarized authority, the consequences are unpredictable, far-reaching, and profoundly unjust. For those who survived the initial gunfire, the scene was one of pure terror. Students ran blindly across campus, some tripping or stumbling over debris, others lying flat on the ground, desperately hoping to avoid the bullets that tore through the night air. Every step, every movement became a gamble between life and death, and the screams of the injured and terrified echoed through the campus like a mournful, haunting chorus. Eyewitnesses recounted how the students who fell or tried to help their friends were themselves in danger, highlighting the indiscriminate nature of the attack. Friends watched in horror as classmates were struck down mere feet away, powerless to intervene, their collective shock and fear forming a silent testimony to the injustice unfolding before them. Some survivors later described how the sounds of gunfire and panicked cries blended into a surreal, almost dreamlike nightmare, where time seemed suspended and the line between safety and danger vanished. The massacre shattered the illusion that the campus could serve as a sanctuary for learning and peaceful activism, revealing instead a harsh reality. Even in places meant to nurture growth and empowerment, violence could intrude, leaving scars that would last a lifetime. The human cost extended beyond the immediate victims. Families received devastating news, and the community at large faced a painful reckoning with the stark reality of systemic injustice and the extreme measures taken to suppress voices seeking equality. The deaths of Hammond, Smith, and Middleton were compounded by the injuries of 28 other students, many of whom carried both visible and invisible wounds for the rest of their lives. These young men and women, who had arrived on campus seeking education, community, and a voice in their society, were instead forced to confront mortality, injustice, and the harsh consequences of challenging the status quo. Through the lens of these individual stories, the Orangeburg Massacre transforms from an abstract historical event into a deeply human tragedy, illustrating the profound courage and vulnerability of those who stand up against oppression. Each name: Samuel Hammond, Henry Smith. Delano Middleton represents a life interrupted, a family grief-stricken, and a community forever marked. Their stories serve as a powerful reminder of the sacrifices inherent in the fight for justice, the indiscriminate cost of systemic violence, and the enduring importance of remembering those whose voices were silenced in the struggle for equality. Despite the shocking magnitude of the Orangeburg Massacre, national media coverage was astonishingly sparse, leaving the tragic events largely obscured from public awareness and depriving the victims and their families of the recognition and attention that such a violent episode warranted. Unlike the Kent State shootings 2 years later, which captured headlines across the country and ignited widespread outrage, the deaths of Samuel Hammond, Henry Smith, and Delano Middleton, along with the injuries inflicted upon 28 other students, received only fleeting mentions in mainstream newspapers and brief radio segments, often framed in a way that obscured the reality of the students' innocence. The narrative promoted by local authorities that the students had provoked the violence was largely unchallenged in national outlets, creating a distorted account that minimized the scale of the tragedy and effectively silenced the voices of the very individuals most affected. This lack of attention was not merely an oversight. It reflected broader societal biases and the media's tendency at the time to prioritize stories that aligned with established narratives, often ignoring or marginalizing the suffering of Black Americans, particularly in smaller towns away from the centers of political and cultural power. Orangeburg, a relatively small community in South Carolina, did not possess the visibility or influence to force a sustained national conversation, and the deaths of young Black students at a historically Black college were treated as peripheral rather than central to the ongoing struggle for civil rights. Whereas events in predominantly white institutions or in more prominent cities often drew immediate scrutiny, outrage, and policy discussions, the massacre in Orangeburg remained a footnote, a haunting chapter relegated to local memory and the archives of committed historians and activists. The consequences of this minimal coverage were profound. Families of the victims and the broader community were left not only to mourn their dead and care for the injured, but also to navigate the additional burden of invisibility, their grief largely unacknowledged outside the town's borders. The students' courage, their disciplined commitment to nonviolence, and the horrific injustice they endured were overshadowed by a national silence that implicitly suggested that their lives, and the struggle they represented, were of lesser consequence. Survivors and community members later recalled a sense of abandonment, feeling that while their pain was immediate and visceral, it was treated as unworthy of broader attention. And the lack of accountability in the media coverage mirrored the lack of legal accountability for the officers who had fired upon the students. Moreover, the contrast with Kent State highlighted the racial and geographic disparities in how tragedy was perceived and reported. When 4 white students were killed in Iowa 2 years later, the nation collectively mourned, political leaders commented publicly, and journalists probed deeply into the causes and implications of the shootings, generating debates, documentaries, and ongoing discussions that cemented the event in the American consciousness. In comparison, Orangeburg, despite its similar scale of violence and the clear innocence of the victims, was largely omitted from the national dialogue, leaving generations of Americans unaware of the massacre and the lessons it held about systemic racism, police militarization, and the suppression of Black voices. The minimal coverage also impacted the pursuit of justice. With the media largely silent, there was less public pressure on the legal system to hold those responsible accountable, allowing narratives that framed the students as aggressors to persist unchallenged and influencing the eventual acquittals of the officers involved. The silencing of the Orangeburg Massacre in mainstream outlets demonstrates the powerful role of visibility in shaping historical memory and underscores the broader societal patterns that have historically marginalized the experiences and suffering of Black communities. In remembering Orangeburg today, it becomes clear that media attention is not merely reportage, it is validation, and the absence of that validation contributed to the erasure of this tragedy from the collective consciousness, making it all the more crucial to document, teach, and reflect upon the events and lives affected. In the wake of the Orangeburg Massacre, the pursuit of justice became a twisted reflection of the systemic failures that had allowed the violence to occur in the first place. While 3 young lives had been taken and dozens more irrevocably scarred, the legal response seemed more intent on preserving institutional authority than addressing the raw and undeniable truth of what had happened. 9 South Carolina Highway Patrol officers, whose rifles had discharged into a crowd of unarmed students, were brought to trial on charges of excessive force. The proceedings, closely watched by a community still reeling from shock and grief, quickly revealed the inequities of a justice system predisposed to favor those in positions of power. Despite eyewitness testimony, the lack of weapons among the students, and clear evidence of indiscriminate firing, the officers were acquitted, their actions excused under the narrative that they had acted in self-defense, threatened by aggression that never truly existed. The courtroom became a stage for a disturbing inversion of justice, where the victims' voices were minimized, their suffering almost entirely subordinated to the claims of those who had perpetrated the violence. Families watched helplessly as the legal machinery, meant to protect and vindicate, instead provided cover for those responsible, reinforcing a broader societal message that the lives of Black students, even in the face of unprovoked and lethal force, were of secondary concern. This miscarriage of justice was compounded by the treatment of Cleveland Sellers, a young and committed activist with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, who had been present on campus advocating for civil rights but had not participated in the shooting itself. Sellers was arrested, charged with inciting a riot, and ultimately convicted, becoming the sole person to face imprisonment in connection with the massacre. Sellers' conviction exemplified the troubling pattern of scapegoating and criminalizing Black activism during the civil rights era. While those who had wielded deadly force walked free, a student and organizer committed to nonviolent protest was punished as though he bore responsibility for the violence. His imprisonment, which lasted a year before the eventual reversal decades later, symbolized the systemic efforts to suppress dissent and delegitimize the pursuit of equality, sending a chilling message to others who might have considered standing against entrenched discrimination. For the families of the victims and the broader community, this legal outcome added another layer of grief to an already devastating tragedy, turning the massacre not only into a story of loss but also into a narrative of profound injustice. The courtroom drama, marked by acquittals and wrongful convictions, also had long-term social implications. It demonstrated the limits of the legal system when confronting entrenched racial power structures and underscored the resilience required of those fighting for justice in a society where law enforcement and judicial systems could be weaponized against marginalized communities. Survivors and activists continued to advocate tirelessly, documenting evidence, preserving testimonies, and insisting that history remember the truth of Orangeburg, even as the nation largely ignored it. Their efforts eventually led to recognition and reparative measures, but the initial legal outcomes left scars, not only on the individuals involved, but on the collective consciousness of a community that had been brutally reminded of its vulnerability. In this complex and painful chapter, the acquittal of the officers and the conviction of Cleveland Sellers crystallized the disparity between power and justice, revealing the systemic challenges that Black Americans faced when seeking redress for violence inflicted upon them. It highlighted the courage required to continue resisting, to continue demanding accountability in the face of overwhelming institutional bias, and to maintain faith that truth, eventually, would prevail. The story of Orangeburg's legal aftermath is a testament to both the fragility of justice, when confronted by systemic inequities, and the enduring strength of those who refuse to allow injustice to define the narrative. It serves as a sobering reminder that while courts may fail, history and memory, preserved by the courage of survivors and advocates, remain powerful tools in the ongoing fight for equality and recognition. For decades, the Orangeburg Massacre lingered in the shadows of history, a painful episode that few outside of South Carolina knew, and even fewer fully understood, reflecting the deep structural inequities that had long governed American society. While the nation collectively mourned and debated other tragedies, the violent deaths of Samuel Hammond, Henry Smith, and Delano Middleton, along with the injuries sustained by dozens of other students, were largely omitted from mainstream historical memory, leaving families, survivors, and their community to carry the weight of grief and injustice largely in silence. The massacre's erasure from the broader narrative of the civil rights movement is not merely a matter of historical oversight but a stark illustration of the systemic undervaluation of Black lives. Particularly in smaller communities and historically marginalized institutions, in the absence of widespread media attention, the massacre became a local, rather than national, story, preserved through the memories of those directly affected and the meticulous work of dedicated historians who refused to let the tragedy fade into obscurity. This invisibility compounded the trauma already inflicted by the violence, as the students and their families faced not only physical and emotional scars, but also the weight of a society that seemed to prioritize the reputations of law enforcement over the lives of the innocent. The acquittal of the 9 officers responsible for opening fire on unarmed students, juxtaposed with the wrongful conviction of Cleveland Sellers, sent a chilling message about whose lives were protected and whose voices were dismissed. Survivors recounted the haunting echoes of that night for years afterward, their memories intertwined with a broader recognition that the country's collective attention and empathy often depended on race, geography, and social power, rather than the scale of tragedy or the innocence of the victims. In Orangeburg, the massacre became a quiet testament to the ongoing struggle for justice, a local wound that mirrored national patterns of systemic oppression. The story of Orangeburg also reveals how memory, history, and social justice are intertwined, highlighting the importance of preserving narratives that might otherwise be lost. Activists, scholars, and family members worked tirelessly to document eyewitness accounts, collect evidence, and educate future generations about the massacre, understanding that forgetting the event would be another form of violence, erasing the lives and struggles of those who had suffered. By keeping the story alive, these efforts challenged the broader societal tendency to marginalize Black voices and underscored the necessity of historical recognition as a form of accountability. The massacre, though long ignored by mainstream narratives, became a symbol of both the dangers faced by those who challenged systemic oppression and the resilience of the community that refused to let the tragedy be forgotten. In many, the prolonged obscurity of the Orangeburg Massacre reflects a troubling truth about American history, that the suffering of Black Americans, especially in smaller towns and outside major national events, has often been deprioritized, leaving the full story of civil rights struggles incomplete. Yet, this erasure also fueled a determination among activists and historians to ensure that the massacre would eventually claim its rightful place in collective memory. The stories of Samuel Hammond, Henry Smith, Delano Middleton, and the surviving students became more than accounts of individual loss. They emerge as enduring reminders of systemic injustice, the fragility of legal and societal protection, and the resilience required to confront oppression. Remembering Orangeburg is not simply an act of historical preservation, it is an affirmation of the value of Black lives, a testament to the courage of those who fought for justice in the face of overwhelming violence, and a stark reminder of the work that remains to confront and dismantle the structures that allowed such a tragedy to be both perpetrated and forgotten. In the years following the Orangeburg Massacre, the quiet courage of survivors, families, and dedicated historians became the cornerstone of a movement to preserve the memory of that tragic night and to ensure that the lessons of Orangeburg would not be lost to time. Despite the initial indifference of mainstream media and the painful miscarriage of justice that followed, these individuals refused to let the story fade into obscurity, understanding that remembrance itself was an act of resistance and affirmation. For decades, they collected testimonies, preserved photographs, documented the experiences of the wounded, and spoke to communities both near and far about the courage and sacrifice of those who had stood for justice. Their work transformed Orangeburg from a largely forgotten incident into a powerful symbol of resilience, illustrating that even in the face of profound violence and systemic oppression, the voices of the oppressed could endure and influence future generations. Through their efforts, the massacre came to be recognized not only as a horrifying instance of police brutality, but also as a testament to the unyielding spirit of young people who demanded equality and human dignity. Memorial services, historical markers, and educational initiatives gradually brought the story to a wider audience, allowing people across the nation to engage with the human dimension of the tragedy, to feel the heartbreak of families who lost sons and brothers, and to honor the bravery of students who risked their lives for justice. The sustained advocacy of survivors and activists also helped challenge the broader societal narrative, emphasizing that the systemic inequities exposed in Orangeburg were not isolated incidents, but part of a larger struggle for civil rights and recognition that continues to this day. Importantly, the memory of the Orangeburg Massacre carries a lesson of enduring relevance, that change often comes at a steep cost, that standing against injustice requires courage, and that the acknowledgement of past wrongs is essential for societal healing. By preserving these stories, survivors and their allies remind us that the fight for equality is ongoing, that every effort to confront discrimination and violence contributes to a more just society, and that the voices of those historically marginalized must never be silenced. The massacre also reinforces the power of collective memory in holding institutions accountable, showing that even when legal systems fail, the truth can survive through the unwavering commitment of those who refuse to forget. As we reflect on the Orangeburg Massacre, it is crucial to honor both the victims and those who continue to preserve their legacy, recognizing that the struggle for racial justice is built upon the courage of individuals who, even in the darkest moments, choose to resist, speak out, and demand change. Their stories inspire reflection, awareness, and action, serving as a reminder that the fight for equality and dignity is never complete but remains a shared responsibility for every generation. Thank you for taking the time to learn about this important chapter in history, to bear witness to the sacrifices of those who fought for justice, and to engage with a story that must never be forgotten. If this video has helped you understand the courage, pain, and resilience of the Orangeburg community, please show your support by liking this video, subscribing to the channel, and sharing it with others so that more people can hear these vital stories and join in remembering those who stood for justice.